When I was a child, my aunt took my room and sent me to live in the basement. Years later, I reclaimed the entire house and turned it into a symbol of revenge, but the worst thing for Karen began when I forced her into that house as a stranger.
Hi, this is the Cold Vengeance community. We share the most captivating and intriguing stories that end in cold revenge. Subscribe and stay with us.
When I was 10, my house in suburban Ohio ceased to be my home. My father lost his factory job, my mother started working shifts at a supermarket, and at the worst possible moment, family came into our lives. My mother's sister, Karen, with her husband, David, and their children, Emily and Josh. They announced they had nowhere to go, but the temporary situation lasted longer than anyone could have imagined. My space for play and schoolwork was quickly taken away, my room was converted into a new nursery, and I was relocated to the basement. The basement turned out to be cold and damp, with musty air and a single mattress pad for a bed. I remembered standing that night among the boxes and looking at my old comic book shelf, which Emily had scattered across the floor as if it were a stage prop. My father turned away silently, my mother tried to smile, and Karen ran the house as if she'd owned it for centuries. From then on, the fate of my room was decided by voices that spoke louder than money and pleas for help. For years, the basement was my world. Lessons in dim light, tired mornings, the constant feeling that everything that was mine was somewhere higher, under the ceiling, in warmth and in voices. The neighbors stopped greeting me when Karen began telling stories about how she helped the family, and Emily and Josh laughed in the faces of my school friends when they learned that I lived in the basement. These taunts cut deeper than cold concrete. When I grew up, went to college in another state, and began building a life in Chicago, the thought of revenge never left my mind. Revenge wasn't an impulse, it was a smoldering program built from grievances, hints, and the knowledge of the importance of waiting for the right moment. My father died slowly. Illnesses, bills, conversations behind closed doors, where Karen recommended medications and savings methods, as if she were doing nothing but kindness, but in reality she was weaving a web. After the funeral, I saw for the first time how tightly Karen held power. Paperwork for the house was discussed in whispers, then officially, and I learned that some of the paperwork had indeed been drawn up to protect the family's interests. My mother listened and nodded, as if the war with the truth was more exhausting than resistance. Then something finally broke. I didn't fight, didn't make noise, didn't demand, I collected information. A lawyer, conversations with distant relatives, old bills, recordings of conversations plucked from neighbors' memories. David once foolishly got himself into a tax hole. Karen's loans contained a default page with late payments and threats. These weren't sentences, but points of support. When I had a stable job and money, I didn't start spending on cars and drinking. Every income went toward repaying what had been taken. I hired a lawyer, reviewed the documents, and discovered that part of the property actually belonged to my father and shouldn't have been transferred without the consent of the heirs. The court wasn't a war of heroes, but a dry machine of laws, paper reports, signatures, formalities. I made claims, filed lawsuits, received subpoenas, and when the process reached the division of property, my family realized they'd missed the opportunity to negotiate quietly. Karen started running around to the neighbors, threatening, pleading, and plotting, but I was like ice, cold and predictable. I didn't just want the house, I wanted the people who thought I was a helpless boy in the basement to feel the same helplessness, the same inner emptiness. When the court ordered the sale of the house and division of the proceeds, David's financial pit and Karen's loans took their toll. They had almost no choice. I bought out the shares, arranging everything in such a way as to leave no loopholes. As Karen signed the papers, she smiled through her teeth, her eyes flickering with a mixture of anger and fear. It was important for me to remember those eyes. The house was officially mine. Entering it for the first time as the owner, I walked through the rooms, the familiarity of every board and every creak returning like a memory. Here we played in the inflatable pool in the summer, here my father mended a chair, here my mother sang about weekdays. I paused at the door to my nursery. The door opened onto the room where Emily and Josh had grown up, where the shelves, wallpaper, and curtains were different. I didn't destroy it, I let in the easy rent of emptiness. The first thing I changed was the address in the mail, then the sign on the doorbell, then the little things. Keys were exchanged, old things were put away in the evenings when no one was there. I kept my distance, giving my family time to despair. Karen was indignant at first, then tried to restore the status quo by pressuring her mother, but she was tired of the constant struggle. I didn't just want revenge, I wanted the memories that had once robbed me of my childhood to return to those who had stolen them, but in the form of those petty humiliations that mend destinies. The first weeks of owning the house were spent in a quiet strategy. I learned where Karen kept her papers, who came for the mail and when, which neighbors were willing to talk and which weren't. Emily, now living next door, tried to get her things back through friends, but I wouldn't give in. One evening was especially memorable. Josh showed up at the gate drunk, demanding a family talk, and I watched as David's pride crumbled from the impossibility of intervening. I made it clear that negotiations were only possible through a lawyer, and Josh left, slamming his fist on the gate. This scene was significant. I saw the former confidence melt away in people who had grown accustomed to owning other people's lives. Revenge began to take shape not in shouting or physical violence, but in cold logic: debt restructuring, property division, control of documents. I kept everything under control, like a chess player who knows which pieces are moving next. But there was no celebration inside. Sometimes an emptiness would awaken. Home had returned, but childhood had not. Then anger filled the void and my plans grew sharper. I thought about how to make Karen understand what it meant to be deprived of her accustomed power. Not to ruin her life, but to rob her of her confidence. One late evening, I changed the locks and left the key with a neighbor, so that word would spread quickly. Karen came in the middle of the night, tried to force the door open, panic flashing in her eyes, then humiliation. My mother stood aside, crying silently, and I felt the revenge begin to work, not for satisfaction, but as a mechanism for restoring justice that I had been building for myself for years. This was not the end yet. I collected clues for the next phase, eavesdropped on conversations, examined loans, looked for moments where I could strike a precise blow, so that each family member would feel another loss of control. My goal remained clear: to get not only the room back, but also to show what it was like to be rejected and abandoned with no friends nearby, neighbors yelling, and nothing in your pocket. There was something brutal, and yet somehow just about it. I didn't romanticize the pain, but rather allowed it to be the engine that drove me to the final reckoning with what had been taken from me in childhood. I decided to act not with screams or destruction, but with a quiet, measured psychological strategy, the same one that had taught me patience and resentment as a child. First, I tidied up the house so that every object could speak. I carefully listed all the things that had belonged to Karen and her children: books, boxes of photographs, Emily's old toys. The inventory was completed by lawyers, each item was assigned a number, and then I sent notices offering to pick up the items within a set period, stating that after that time, the items would be disposed of in accordance with the law. Karen responded by throwing a tantrum at the front door, demanding keys and access. David tried to pressure my mother to persuade me to return the family property, but my mother looked as if exhaustion sagged deeper than any desire to fight again. I made no promises because I didn't have to explain anything. The house was mine on paper, and the law was on my side. The next step was simple and brutal in its routine. I began changing the small rituals that made the house their home. In the mornings, a cup of Karen's dried lipstick sat in the kitchen. I'd removed it during the first week and left it prominently in a bag marked, "Found in the kitchen, available upon request." Occasionally, I'd send short, formal notices in the mail: "Your belongings are being held in storage for up to 30 days. These papers looked official, and Karen didn't realize that it was precisely the fear of bureaucracy that weighed most heavily on someone accustomed to command. I installed several cameras on the outer corners of the house and posted a discreet notice about surveillance. The cameras worked to his advantage, recording break-ins, screams, and late-night visits, and the recordings became a tool of quiet power for me. The first time Emily tried to sneak inside under cover of night, I showed the footage to my mother, not to accuse her in court, but to demonstrate that control had returned within these walls. Emily, grown up but still dependent on her mother's opinion, was first angry, then crying into her mother's phone, and finally writing me pleading messages. I responded briefly, pointing out the procedure: a call from a lawyer, a time to release things. This ritual, small and subtle, systematically unsettled Karen from her habitual state of power, where before the command to give orders worked automatically, now she had to beg, prove, humiliate herself on paper. Gradually, I began to change the visual memory of the house. I took down the old family photograph of Dad standing bareheaded next to my younger self, restored it and hung it back up, but I hung it prominently in the hallway so that everyone who came would see not a smiling Karen, but what had once been ours. A small thing, perhaps, but Karen saw that photograph differently. The face in the picture closed the door to a past in which I too had been. I rearranged the living room furniture without drama, leaving a toy baseball from my childhood prominently displayed. a memory tool now back in its place for the first time in years. One evening stood out. Emily came over with a friend for a peace talk, and upon entering the living room, she froze in the doorway upon seeing the ball. The pause lasted longer than the conversation, and this silence was a victory for me. Next, I began hosting small gatherings and dinners at the house, inviting neighbors and my father's old friends. I knew Karen clung to the illusion of social acceptance. Now the gatherings proceeded without it. Some of the invitees responded not out of malice, but because many on the street had long known how the in-laws had broken into the house, and there was a growing desire among the neighbors to hear the truth firsthand. At one of these dinners, I quietly recounted the evenings I'd spent in the basement, how my father tried to argue and how my mother nodded in exhaustion. The stories were short and to the point. No one yelled at the guests, no one demanded excuses, but the atmosphere in the house changed. Guests began coming with questions for Karen, who tried to smile, but now her smile was awkward. I didn't publish the accusations on social media because I didn't want to smear real revenge with publicity. Private retribution had to remain private. Next, I addressed the issues that particularly bothered Karen, mail and petty privileges. I carefully forwarded all notifications sent to the old address to her mailbox, even if they were advertising brochures. The intrusion was barely noticeable, but a world where a person doesn't receive the usual signs of attention quickly begins to crumble. One evening, I allowed myself a small, cruel joke. I left a note from the neighbors on the kitchen table, a polite reminder to keep the place clean and quiet after 10 p.m. Karen had to read this note aloud to her mother, and her face paled with the realization that her former authority had melted away. My war wasn't about shouting, but about deprivation of the control we'd become accustomed to, deprivation of the small privileges that made life comfortable. A key part of my strategy was managing the space where Karen kept her little secrets. I organized the basement and attic where the boxes with her certificates and documents were kept. I placed letters my mother had once written under a layer of dust and set them aside to demonstrate at the right moment how much time had been wasted in pretense. David dropped by the house uninvited several times and demanded an explanation, but I replied calmly, legally, through a lawyer. Repeating this phrase 5 times broke the habit of accusing me of personal greed. David was beginning to look like a man incapable of managing his own life. At this stage, I employed a network of small attacks. Early morning calls from unknown collectors mistakenly believing there was a sale of old items near the house, carefully planned visits from social workers regarding trivial security issues, all official and legal, but creating the feeling that an inspection was looming over the house. Karen called relatives, plotted revenge, and argued that all these actions were illegitimate, but the responses were formal and cold-blooded. I saw her accustomed role of mistress of the situation cracking. One of the most subtle yet painful measures was restricting access to those corners of the house where Emily and Josh's childhood things were kept. They would come and ask permission to enter the room where they had once played, and I wouldn't open the door. Karen would go to her mother at night pleading, but her mother would reply, "You knew how it all turned out," and this "you" was not only a reproach but also a rejection of her previous support. It was a blow I'd known since childhood, the absence of someone to stick a finger in a leak. Sometimes I felt ashamed of my coldness, but every time Karen asked for even the slightest bit of her former power, I saw the image of the little boy in the basement and understood that pain deserved the truth and the truth can be cruel. I also began to control the little things that made everyday life possible: the keys to the front door, the remote control for the garage, the toolbox in the shed. These things had once been freely accessible, now they were under my protection, and any unexpected visit turned awkward when the visitor realized they couldn't enter peacefully. Emily once showed up with flowers and tried to negotiate a peaceful neighborly relationship. I accepted the flowers, placed them on the table, and said the visitor could pick up the things at an appointed time. She left empty-handed, crying in the car, a scene I witnessed as if from the outside, and it acted as a catalyst within me. I wasn't bloodthirsty, I was methodical. The climax of the psychological phase came when Karen tried to regain at least a semblance of control through outward show. She showed up with a hairdresser, ordered a cake for the get-together, wanting to demonstrate that everything was fine. I allowed the meeting, but arranged for the table to be placed in the hall, blocking the entrance to the room where her old things were stored. Karen responded by throwing a fit, but the guests I'd invited sat silently and listened. If Karen's power had previously been enough to convince the neighbors, now their complaints rang hollow. Rumors began to circulate that the house had been passed to the son, not through indifference, but through a fair procedure, and people were uncomfortable supporting a man who lived in the basement and kept silent. I kept this social aspect separate because the psychological warfare had to be focused. First, destroy internal comfort, then reinforce it with external isolation. I ended the second phase differently than I had planned, not loudly and not with revenge for revenge's sake, but with a quiet victory that left Karen feeling powerless. One night Karen came to the gate and knocked, asking to be let in, begging for a conversation. I stood by the window and watched as a face accustomed to commands now begged like a beggar. Her mother watched from the other side and didn't interfere. I opened the door, took the documents, and handed them over the threshold. Here's the list. Get it signed by a lawyer and be back on time. She took the papers with trembling hands, and in that moment I realized that the psychology of revenge had worked. Not the destruction of lives, but the deprivation of her accustomed status led to her inner devastation. I wasn't happy, but I felt I'd done what I'd set out to do with adolescent prudence, not with blood, but with the law and the small, daily expulsions to regain my self-respect. In the silence after all that war, the house felt like it belonged to me again, but a hole remained in that peace, the emptiness of lost years that no amount of rearrangement could ever bring back. Revenge had cleared the space, but it hadn't given me my childhood back. Instead, it had begun to teach me a new lesson: how to live in a house where memory had become a tool, not a comfort. When the house was finally in my hands, and the first wave of psychological pressure on Karen and her family had done its work, I decided that I needed to turn these walls into a symbol of what had once been taken from me, and a symbol of what I had regained at the cost of years, anger, and cold calculations. I didn't want to simply sit in these rooms and silently stare at the walls that had once been stolen from me. I wanted every inch of this house to speak of who it now belonged to. The first thing I did was tackle my former childhood room, the very one Karen had given to her children without hesitation when I was 10. I restored the floor, repainted the walls a calm color, and brought back items from my childhood that had been stored in boxes in the basement: an old baseball, a few books, comic books with yellowed pages, a poster of the team I'd adored in school. The room became mine again, not as a child's room anymore, but as an office where every detail reminded me of the past and showed that this space was now mine alone. I deliberately left the door open when neighbors or distant relatives came over, so that everyone could see how the space once given over to other people's children was once again mine. Then I went even further. In the living room, where Karen hosted her gatherings and received guests, I hung a large photograph of my father, placed his tools nearby, and a few of his favorite objects. It was my way of telling everyone that my father had always been the master of this house, and now it was I, his son, and not the impostors who had intruded into our lives. I replaced the furniture in the kitchen and left only one old table, the very one where we once dined together as a family, before Karen had even dreamed of moving in. This table became the center of the kitchen, and every time Karen walked in and saw it, her face would twist with memories, because at this table she loved to bark orders and play host. Now she sat at it as a guest, and I saw in her eyes the same humiliation I had once felt in the basement. I wasn't simply rebuilding the house for comfort. I was deliberately turning it into a museum of memories of how I was deprived of the right to be a child, and how I regained that right, albeit years later. I renovated the basement where I spent my childhood and turned it into a gym. Now it was filled with exercise equipment, mats, and a punching bag. Every time Karen or her children came in to pick up the remaining boxes, they saw that the place where they had once kept me as an unwanted tenant had now been transformed into a space of strength and growth. I deliberately took my time removing their old things from the basement, leaving them neatly folded in a corner so they could see their past huddled in the shadow of a new present where they no longer belonged. It was my way of showing them that their role now was to be memories, lying like dusty weights in a corner. Gradually, the entire house filled with symbols. I hung photos of my childhood on the walls, where I could still see the smile I'd left before my room was taken away. I left school certificates and diplomas in the hallway so that Karen and her children, when they came in, would see that everything I'd achieved had grown up not because of them, but in spite of them. They came by from time to time, sometimes for things, sometimes for conversation, but every step they took through the house became a reminder that they were now strangers. The hardest blow for Karen was when I completely remodeled her former bedroom. She and David had once felt like the bosses of this house, and their room symbolized their power. I converted it into a guest bedroom and rented it out to tourists visiting our town. For Karen, this was truly humiliating. Her former Holy of Holies had become a room for random visitors. Every time one of them came out onto the porch in the morning and greeted the neighbors, Karen saw how her past had become part of the business, and that was what killed her most. I heard from neighbors that she complained to them about me turning the house into a showpiece, but no one supported her anymore. The neighbors knew I deserved this house, and everyone remembered how I lived in the basement for years while she played hostess. I hosted dinners with the neighbors, telling stories about how my father built this house, how my mother decorated it, how I grew up here until I was sent downstairs. All these stories shaped a new image of the house in the eyes of people, and Karen could no longer control it. I saw how every time she came here she felt out of place, and that was part of my revenge. I didn't break her directly, I broke her memory, broke her sense of power, forced her to confront the fact that the symbols she once used were now used against her. In the garden, I restored the old swing my father made for me when I was little. Karen had once ordered it removed because her children were too old for foolishness. Now the swing was back, and I saw Josh, grown and crushed by life, sit on it one day and sit for a long time, as if remembering a time when everything was less gloomy. For me it was another sign. Everything was returning to where it began, only the roles were reversed. Karen could no longer command either the space or the memories. Every corner of this house now lived the story of my revenge. The living room became a room dedicated to my father's memory, the kitchen, a place where I was the boss, Karen's bedroom, a business for strangers, the basement, a symbol of strength, and my nursery, the office of a grown man who had reclaimed what was his. Every time Karen crossed the threshold, her gaze slid over these symbols, and I saw how they killed her more than any words could. She wasn't just losing her home in terms of documentation, she was losing it in meaning. Everything that had once made her strong now reminded her of her defeat. For me, this was the greatest victory. I had ensured that the house would never again be hers. It was now my world, my fortress, and my museum of the pain I had endured and weaponized. And in this museum, Karen and her family would always be visitors, forbidden to touch the exhibits. Karen tried to hold on, but I could see her strength ebbing. All her complaints about the neighbors no longer carried weight, because the street knew the truth and remembered my story. Her children grew increasingly distant. David stopped interfering, as if resigned to the fact that his control over the house was irrevocably lost. But I knew the end was still to come, and I wasn't going to let this story slide. I needed a moment when Karen would come to me, admit defeat, and try to somehow reclaim control. And that moment arrived faster than I expected. One evening she knocked on the door, her voice trembling. I opened it and saw a woman who no longer resembled the self-assured woman who had taken my room. Her face was haggard, her eyes darted, and her words were stuck in her throat. She suggested we talk and go into the kitchen. I sat at the old table, the very one where we once ate dinner as a family, and where she would later turn the meal into a stage for her orders. Now the roles were reversed and I was in charge. Karen began by admitting, "I understand, the house is yours and there's no point in arguing with that anymore." Then she added that she was having a hard time, that the neighbors had stopped saying hello, that Emily couldn't find a job, and that Josh had gotten involved with questionable company again. She explained that the children weren't suffering because of her, but because I'd allegedly too demonstratively taken away their ground. I listened silently and didn't interrupt, because I was curious to see the extent to which she was willing to humiliate herself in order to regain at least some control. And finally she blurted out, "I want us to come to an agreement. At least leave us the right to come here sometimes, let my children keep the place where they grew up." I smiled, because this was exactly what I was waiting for. She had come to me as a petitioner, and now everything depended solely on my will. I didn't refuse outright. I paused and said I would consider her request, but with conditions. The first condition was that she had to officially admit that she had occupied the house illegally for many years and sign papers, clearly stating that they had been using it fraudulently all this time. The second was that neither she nor her children would ever again be able to lay claim to any part of the property, even in theory. The third condition was the most stringent. Every visit had to be agreed upon with me personally, and she could only enter the house as a guest, at a pre-arranged time, not as the hostess. I saw Karen's face turn pale, but she understood she had no choice. Either she accept these conditions or leave forever, leaving the children without even the faintest connection to this place. She was silent for a long time, her fingers trembling, but finally she nodded. For me, it was the moment of final victory. Signing the papers took a couple of days. I made everything official so she would never have a chance to return to this story again. Karen arrived with David, but he looked as if this was no longer his battle. He simply sat and signed the documents emotionlessly. I saw how excruciating this was for Karen, how each signature seemed to tear a piece of her past from her. After the papers were completed, I invited her to walk through the house again as a guest, so she would understand the rules of the new reality. We walked through the rooms, and I deliberately lingered where I found the symbols of my vengeance. In the study nursery she stood with her eyes downcast, in the basement she sighed heavily, and when we reached the former bedroom now occupied by guests her hands trembled so much she could barely hold her bag. I could see that this was worse than death for her. As we left I said, "Now you can only come here when I say so, this house will never be yours again." She nodded, not looking up. This was the culmination of all my revenge. I forced her to go through the same path I had once taken. If as a child I had been deprived of the right to a room, now I had deprived her of the right to the entire house. If then I had lived like a guest in my own home, now she had become a guest in the house where she had once felt like a queen. The neighbors saw what had happened and stopped perceiving Karen as part of the street. Now she came occasionally, but her visits were pitiful. She sat quietly, like a stranger, and never raised her voice. Even her children began to avoid these visits, because they could not bear to watch their mother, who had always pretended to be strong, now humiliate herself in front of the man she had once humiliated. For me, this was the end of the story. I had received not just a house, I had received recognition that the truth was on my side. Every symbol in this house now worked against Karen, her every appearance was a reminder of her defeat, and I no longer felt like that boy from the basement. I was a grown man who had gotten what was his and shown that justice could come even after decades. But at the same time, I felt a strange emptiness. I thought that after that final scene I would feel relief, but instead I felt as if my whole life had revolved around revenge for the past few years, and now that the goal had been achieved, there was a gaping void ahead. I sat on the porch of that very house watching Karen leave, and I understood that she had received her punishment, and I had gotten the house, but the years of childhood could never be brought back. And yet this was my choice, my path, and my ending. Now I was the master, and that was what mattered.